Hi there. So I'm back in my sewing room, and today I'm working on a project, and I thought that it just might be a good opportunity for me to also take the time to turn on my camera and videotape for you what I'm actually going to be doing. So yesterday I embroidered out this pumpkin design. I purchased this design from the embroidery library, and I stitched it out on some starched linen. This is a 100% linen. And I did back my linen with some of the fusible knit interfacing that gave it some extra stability. So how I prepped my fabric was that I did go ahead and I used some heavy spray starch on it. I let that starch soak in, and the substance of the linen was actually probably considered somewhere in between a light and a medium weight linen. And so it had a pretty good amount of body built into it, and so I didn't really feel like I needed to put a whole lot of starch, and it actually embroidered out really beautifully just with one layer of starch on this mid-weight linen and with that fusible interfacing on the back side. At one point during the embroidery process, just to clue you in, I also added in a piece of some tearaway because I saw that I was likely going to be getting some puckering around this area where the stem is embroidered at. And so I did put some tearaway in there for that area of the design. But basically it was a pretty lightweight design, and I don't really need to go into a lot of detail about why I chose this design, but I'm going to make it into a little pillow cushion that I can put in my living room. Another thing I just want to have you notice about it is I did use the AccuStitch program, and I created a square border using some decorative stitches that I also embroidered out as part of this hooping. This is stitched out in the square 23 hoop, and it almost fills up the entire hoop. It came out really pretty. So today, as I'm continuing to work on my little pillow, I decided that I was going to try a technique in which I was going to put in my zipper and use some decorative stitches to do that. Now, it's not a brand new idea. I've seen one Janome educator actually did this technique earlier in the summer. This is the summer of 2020 that I'm talking about. And I also saw another teacher back on the internet whose name is Margaret Moorhead, who also did this same technique. So today I'm just using some of their ideas, and hopefully mine's going to come out just perfect for what I want for my pillow. So let me tell you what my supplies are that I'm using. My back side of my pillow is the same fabric that I used for the front. I did put one layer of starch on this, but I didn't put any extra interfacing on here since it is just going to be the back of the pillow. So that's my fabric. What I did with it is I actually drew a line right down the center of the design of the fabric. You can see that there. Basically divided my fabric in half. Where my zipper is going to go is going to be right down the center back of my pillow. All right, the zipper that I chose to use today is actually a metal zipper. And this is just something that I got out of my zipper stash of things that I've got a huge collection of things. I wanted to have a metal zipper on this project because I just kind of thought that it would add a little bit of extra interest, I guess. So I'm going to be using this metal zipper. When you do use a metal zipper, there's a couple of things you are going to have to be aware of, and that is that you obviously are not going to be able to sew across the teeth on the zipper because that would break your needle. And we don't want that to happen. And so I'm going to have to keep that in mind as I'm inserting this zipper. My fabric piece is a little bit over 12 inches. It's somewhere around 12. The finished size of my pillow is going to be 11 inches square. And so I cut my fabric, I think it's 12 inches or 12 and a half inches or something in that vicinity. So what I'm going to be doing actually is top stitching this zipper down on top of my fabric. And then I'm going to be using some decorative stitches to embellish it. The other thing that I do have in my stash, because it is a metal zipper, is I have a pair of little nippers that I bought at a hardware store, and these little nippers are actually going to help me later on when my zipper is inserted to pull out those extra metal teeth that I don't want up in the seam allowance of my zipper of my pillow. So my zipper is going to be longer than my pillow fabric. I think, as I said a while ago, that my zipper, I think this is a 14-inch zipper, and it's barely overlapping, so I must have cut my fabric at about 13 inches. So you just need to keep that in mind for whatever the dimensions are for the project that you're making this for. The other stuff that I'm going to be using is some pins. So I'm using my long pins with the little flower heads or the little button tops on them. You do want to use a nice sharp pin that's also got some length to it because we are going to be pinning our zipper down. And I'm using also some stabilizer. This is the Jenny Haskins Hoop Magic Stabilizer, which is a sticky tearaway. And this is going to also help to stabilize our stitches as we're stitching them down, and it's going to be very helpful. So you're going to need something very similar to this one. I chose to not use a water soluble because I do want to be able to just tear this off of the project when I'm finished with the stitching, and therefore I'm not going to have to wash my cushion like I would have to if I was using a water soluble. And then of course you're going to need some decorative stitching thread and also just some regular sewing thread. So for your sewing thread, what you're going to be looking for, this is not the one I'm actually going to be using because my zipper is a very pale off-white, and I'm going to be using a pale off-white upper thread to stitch my zipper down. So that's the supplies I'm using, and we'll get sewing. So my first step of inserting my zipper is going to be placing my zipper with the right side facing up, right on top of that line that I drew down the center of my fabric. And what I'm going to be doing here is using these long pins that I have mentioned already. And what I'm going to just be doing is putting a big long pin into the zipper like that. And I'm going to be doing that the entire length down of the entire zipper here. One of the things that we just need to also remember is that we do want to keep the zipper teeth right down on top of that line that we drew onto our fabric. And the other thing that we're going to do, which will be really helpful, is if we put some of the pins facing in this direction and if we put some of the pins facing in that direction. And the reason why we do that is because when we're actually at the sewing machine and it's time to start sewing this down, we're going to be able to pull out the pins as we need to temporarily as we're stitching, but not remove them completely from our project. All right, so that's how you're going to get your zipper down on your fabric. I'm going to pause the video while I complete all of my pinning. My machine is set up for sewing, and what I have used on my machine is I'm using my HP foot and plate. And the reason why I'm doing that is because I do love the straight stitch that I can get with this HP foot. And also the other thing about it is what I'm going to be doing is just sewing a straight line of stitching down the side of my zipper. I'm going to go all the way down my zipper, and I'm going to tie off here at the end, and then I'm going to come back up on the opposite side of the zipper. All right, so as I'm sewing, the other thing that I want you to notice is that I'm going to be using, my stitch length is set at about a 2.4, which is the default for stitch number 1. Stitch number 1 also doesn't have any tie-ins or tie-offs on it. And so now that I'm thinking about that, I'm actually going to switch to stitch number 3. All right, stitch number 3 will give me the little knot to begin and to end with. So where I'm positioning my needle on my fabric, I'm hoping that this will show up well on the camera. If I zoom in here just a little bit, maybe you can see this. That I'm going to let the left side of my zipper teeth not really quite ride up against the teeth. The zipper teeth are not going to be right up against the side of my foot, but just probably I'm going to move my fabric just a little bit away, and actually where my needle is falling is somewhere very close to the edge of my zipper. All right, I don't want it to fall off of the edge of the zipper. I do just want to make sure that it's somewhere in this vicinity here. Maybe about 1/8 of an inch away would be a good way to describe it. All right, so I'm going to begin sewing, and I'm going to start right up at the top edge of the fabric, lowering my needle, press her foot down, and I'm going to begin sewing here. And let's see. Here we go. So the reason that I wanted you to put pins in both directions is that we're going to temporarily remove some of these pins. But then after we get past that area, go ahead and insert the pin once again. And the reason why we're going to do that is because we still have to sew this left other side of the zipper. And we want to make sure that our pins are staying in our fabric and our zipper so things will stay lined up. So I'm going to pause the video while I complete sewing this edge of the zipper. Coming to the end of sewing down my zipper, and as you can see, I've been removing the pins as I've been sewing along. What I also want you just to remember is that my zipper is just slightly longer. Actually, it's a little bit shorter, not even really longer than my actual fabric piece here is. So depending on the length of the zipper that you're using and the size of the piece of fabric that you are inserting it into, you may actually have an opportunity to not have to do these as two separate lines of stitching like I did on mine. You actually may be able to sew across the ends on either end of your little project. All right, so I'm hoping that that's going to show. And mine, I just had to break my threads here because I obviously didn't have enough space. And remember also that because my zipper is a metal zipper, I didn't want to have to sew across that and risk breaking a needle on those metal teeth. All right, so my zipper is inserted. It's basically just top stitched onto my fabric. And what I'm now going to do is on the back side of this, I'm going to turn my fabric over to the back side. And I'm going to use a pair of sharp scissors, and I'm actually going to cut a slit underneath this place where my zipper is at. So I'm going to get my super sharp little Kai scissors. These are some embroidery scissors that I like quite a bit. And I'm just very, very carefully going to get inside of here, and I'm going to trim my fabric right down the center of that zipper. All right, so I'm hoping that this is going to show, and you can kind of see that the light is hitting my fabric. And I can even see where the teeth are at because my window is behind the fabric. And I'm just going to trim there. And then when I finish trimming this open, I'm going to take this back to my iron, and I'm going to press this seam open away from the zipper. And then I'll show you what comes next. So one thing that I thought I ought to mention to you is if you are using a zipper that's a considerable length longer than the piece of fabric that you're inserting it into, when you're opening this slit up here, don't cut it all the way to the end. All right, so mine is a little bit open because my zipper is just barely long enough for my pillow that I'm making. So what you want to do is just trim maybe about 1 inch to 5/8 of an inch or so away from this final tack that you did up here. Go ahead and use your scissors and trim at a slight diagonal here up into that corner. Okay, and what we're going to be doing is we're going to be folding all of this back, and we're going to be pressing it down with an iron here at the ironing board. All right, kind of like that. And then we're going to be opening all these seam allowances open like so, and we're going to be pressing all of this open and away from that zipper. All right, so that's what the next step in inserting this zipper is all about. So now before we head back to the sewing machine to finish sewing our project, I've got a piece of that tearaway sticky stabilizer that I mentioned earlier and a straight pin, and what I'm going to do is just score this just to get a little scratch going here so I can start peeling this off. And we're going to be sticking this down onto the back side of our zipper. All right, so that's the next step. Remember that if this sticky stabilizer gets stuck on itself, you've got a mess going on. So it looks like I didn't cut my piece quite long enough, so I'll have to go back to the cutting board and get a little bit more. Just go ahead and stick it down onto the back side of your zipper. And what this is doing is it's going to give us some stability for our decorative stitches. And along with doing that, it's also going to be sticking down those seam allowances that we just pressed out of the way with our iron. All right, so that's your next step, and then we'll be ready to do some more sewing at the machine. So I'm back at the machine, and what I've done is I have changed from my HP foot and plate back over into my decorative stitching plate. And I have inserted my F2 open toe foot onto my ankle that I'm now going to be screwing back onto my machine to get ready to do my decorative stitching. So one of the things that I did do when I was creating the front of this pillow was that, as I mentioned before, I had been using the AccuStitch program, and one of the stitches that's in there is this heirloom stitch number 11. At least on the machine, it's called heirloom 11. I don't know exactly what the number is if you were in the AccuStitch program. So this is a stitch that I'm going to choose to use to stitch down on my zipper. So I've got that set up on my machine, and the only change that I'm actually making to this stitch is that I'm actually going to narrow it down a little bit from its 9mm width. I think I'm going to go ahead and take that down to something that's a little bit more manageable. I think I'm going to keep it probably at about 7.5, and I'm adjusting that on my machine right now, and I'm not moving the camera so you can see it. So what I will be doing is using the center divot or the little mark on my presser foot, and I'm going to let that ride right along the edge of my zipper as I'm stitching down. And I'm hoping that it's not going to be too wide. What I will be doing as I begin stitching is I probably think it would be a good idea for us to move this zipper pull out of the way temporarily while we start to stitch. And then the other thing that we might want to do, is just make sure that your edge of your presser foot here is going to still ride along the edge of your zipper teeth, because you don't want this to get too close and you'll have trouble stitching. So I'm just going to go ahead and begin stitching my zipper down, and when I come back you'll see the finished effect. So it's coming out really pretty, as you can see, and one of the things that I just also want to have you be super careful about as you're stitching this out is just really make sure that as you're following the edge of your zipper here, and of course mine's not showing up that well because this is a very light color fabric and zipper, is just make sure that that line on your zipper foot is following right along the edge of your zipper. That's what I'm following anyway, so that my decorative stitch is coming out straight on my fabric. So depending on the stitch that you have chosen, you might actually need to be doing something slightly different. What I'm doing now is raising my presser foot back up, and I'm going to take that zipper slider back up out of the way as I'm approaching that area where it was at. And I will continue to sew, and I just thought that would be important for you to know that. I'll continue sewing along, and I will be back with some more information in a little bit. As you can see, I'm getting close to the end of my second side on my zipper, and you'll also notice that I did stop and pause my machine. Make sure your needle is down when you do this, and I moved the zipper tab out of the way so that as I'm approaching the top end of this zipper here, I don't have that zipper tab in my way that's would likely to have my stitches start getting all crooked. So just about there, and there is my zipper inserted with decorative stitches. Looks really pretty. I think that if you wanted to, you could go ahead and, as long as you had some stabilizer underneath here, you could go ahead and add more rows of decorative stitches in if you wanted to. The stitch that I chose here on my project actually kind of gives me the appearance of a zipper that may have been inserted using a cover stitch machine, or maybe a flat lock on a serger or something. I like the way it looks, and I think it's going to be pretty on the back side of my pillow. Let's get all this together. Let's just pretend that we've got a pillow all made up here. There's the back side. Let's zoom out a little bit and take a look. It's really pretty, and it coordinates well with the front, don't you think? Yeah, I think so too. So here's the final zipper inserted into the back of my fabric. Let me go ahead and pull up the zipper pull all the rest of the way. It's a little bit sticky back there because the sticky stabilizer is still on the back side of my fabric. As you can see, that's what it looks like. Touch, don't you think? Gave it a little bit of a unique look, slightly different than if we had just gone ahead and used any other regular zipper insertion technique. So here's the front of my little cushion, and there's the back of my cushion. And I think that the stitches are going to coordinate really pretty, and just something a little bit different than the normal. So anyway, next step would be for us to just go ahead and take this off and remove the rest of our sticky stabilizer from the back side of our fabric. Or if you have enough sticky stabilizer on here that's extending beyond the decorative stitches you just did, you might want to go ahead and add on a couple of more rows of stitches if you so chose to. Embellish it to your heart's content and have fun inserting your own decorative stitch zipper. I was going to say into a cushion or a pillow, but you know what? You could even put this on a garment or on a tote bag, or gosh, let your imagination run wild and have fun with this technique. Thanks for watching. It was a fun time sewing with you. Bye for now.